Hey everybody, and welcome back to the History Reader. In today's video we are doing part 2 of James Holland's The War in the West, volume 1, and this is part of the read along we're doing for Nonfiction November alongside David Murphy. So I will chuck his videos, I'll link his videos down below so you can go watch them. We're doing one part a week. The book is split into 4 parts, so that's really convenient, and they're relatively manageable in length as well, so that's really nice. If you're reading sort of a average-ish amount, you should be able to quite easily get this done in sort of 3 or 4 evenings. If you're reading David's amount, you can get the whole book done in a single evening. So part 2 is titled Germany Triumphant, and full disclosure, I actually recorded this video a couple of days ago. I was reading the book quite fast at the beginning of the month, and then I finished the part 2 like about a week before I then went to film the video, and had already started part 3 at that point. And it was just a bit rusty, and I didn't like how the video turned out, and there was also a bit of a technical glitch that I just scrapped the last video and I'm trying again. So just full disclosure on that. If it sounds like I'm repeating stuff I've said before, that is why. So the part is titled Germany Triumphant, and the reason for that is that we basically look from the end of that phony war period where there's a lull in the action in the West and focus on this sort of drive, the campaign where Germany drives the British and French armies back, culminating in Dunkirk, but also we focus on the campaign up in Scandinavia, in Norway and Denmark, etc. And these 2 campaigns go really well for the Germans. Obviously that then sets up the strategic situation for the rest of the war. In this part, Holland is doing a couple of things. The first is he's explaining how the campaigns are fought. He also explains why, particularly the northern regions are so important. And then he also explains in some detail why the British and French effort is so lackluster at this point, despite the fact that the British and French armies actually aren't as weak and badly equipped as they kind of commonly get made out to be. He goes through in quite some detail looking at the structure of the various structures within the army, and how they're equipped and what their strength actually looks like, so that we get a better idea of the relative strengths of the 2 sides. And he comes back to this idea of needing like a 3-to-1 manpower advantage to make an attack work, basically. So why fight in Norway and Denmark, etc.? The answer really comes back to the fact that resources are such a crucial part of this war. And we come back to it, if you read any history of the war, you come back to it again and again and again, that this resource is needed or that resource is needed. And making sure that you've got the supply chains effectively set up to get those resources into your industry so that you can produce the war materials is very crucial. And for Germany, they need the iron ore that is going to come in from Scandinavia. And so they really need to sort of take control up there so that they can control that iron ore. The other reason why it's really crucial that they do is to control the waterways between Europe, or mainland Europe, and like that Scandinavian area. Because the Royal Navy would quite easily be able to cut off those supply chains, or not quite easily, but they would be a threat to those supply chains if they didn't. So, and the Royal Navy does start to mine that crossing, and so Germany decide to invade there. Why doesn't Britain go ahead and sort of land there? The first reason is basically that they're a little bit more cautious about using their army to go and do things. Obviously, it is an act of war, and it's a fairly big step to land an army somewhere. They don't want to be seen as aggressors. But there's also this like fog of war that occurs, and this is something that Holland does really, really well here, because we can go back and we can look at decisions that were made and come up with the reasoning for the decision from the sources and what everybody said, why the decision was made. But what is really hard to capture is the fact that the situation is changing. All the time it's changing. And it's incredibly difficult to make these types of decisions. I have done some like crisis simulations where in the one that I did, we all took up government positions and had to coordinate department stuff to respond to various crises. And when you're in the heat of it, the overwhelming sense you've got is that things are moving and you're constantly behind. Someone else is doing something. This decision, like this chain of decision making is happening, and at some point you can't sort of reverse the decisions, because then you're going back and you're refighting old battles amongst yourselves. And Holland shows how this is happening incredibly well. The way that personal, not necessarily rivalries, but personal relationships and how different people work together has an effect on how quickly decisions are made. And that has a direct bearing on what happens here. There are certain people who hold positions of power and then make things happen a certain way, not out of necessarily incompetence, although that is the case sometimes, or like just malice or anything like that. They just do things a certain way, and because of the way things are structured, that happens. And decisions aren't made in calm, considered, slow-moving environments. There's high pressure, it's war. And Holland does this really, really well. And so really what it comes down to is that there wasn't enough commitment on the British side to stop the Germans getting control of Scandinavia. They just moved too slowly to get to that point where they realize they need to do it. And by the time they realize that, it's too late. And the Germans have invaded with a fairly light force and have managed to take control. So that's that part. And then we look at the invasion of France, which is the thing that we all know about. This drive up through the Ardennes with the panzers and that like punching the hole through the French line and encircling and then sending like creating this encircling movement and pushing the British back to Dunkirk, where they then have to evacuate. And there's this idea that has come down through documentaries and whatnot, that this is called Blitzkrieg, and it's a German invention, specifically around having these tanks and these armored divisions, these mechanized divisions, and they're going to move through like this. And the big stumbling block was that nobody thought you could get through the Ardennes that quickly. And there's some truth to that, of course. But Holland goes and he examines the fact that Prussian military doctrine has always fought this moving war, and that this isn't a major diversion from old German tactics, but it's an evolution of it based on the technology. And so while it kind of seems in some cases like the French should have known that this was going to happen, and the British should have known that this was going to happen, it's also not crazy. It's not a crazy assumption that they made that the attack was going to come from the north, because that's what the Prussians had always done. They'd always attacked in this moving way. They did it in 1914, moving across the north and then circling around to try to get to Paris. So it's not a crazy decision that was made to defend the northern reaches up until the end of the Maginot Line. But obviously it was, in the end, the wrong decision. And then the last section we have here is the evacuation from Dunkirk. And this is where there's a lot of myth-making, and I don't feel that Holland really dispelled the myths enough. It's obviously he's British. It's kind of a founding myth of modern Britain that all these little sailors and fishermen got in their boats and went across the channel and picked up as many soldiers as they could, and it was this great mobilization and a heroic moment for Britain. But it wasn't really that. There was elements of heroism in it, but a lot of the boats were actually just requisitioned and taken by the Royal Navy, and there were Royal Navy sailors driving the boats across or sailing the boats across. And I don't think Holland does a good enough job here of making that clear, given the veracity of the myth and how widely it is believed. I don't think he does a good enough job of kind of smacking it down a bit. It's not the end of the world, but I do think that he could have spent at least a paragraph exploring that. He also, weirdly, and I may have missed it to be honest, but he doesn't explore this idea that Hitler halted the Germans and the Panzers as they were approaching Dunkirk, which is held up in a lot of other histories as the reason why the evacuation was so successful. He doesn't spend a lot of time on it if it was in here. And to be honest, it could be, and I missed it because he spent such a small amount of time. He puts it more onto this heroic defense, like the defensive perimeter that was set up, which is probably actually the more towards the correct interpretation, I think, from what I know. But again, I think this myth dispelling is probably worth spending time dealing with the popular perceptions of what happened and explaining them, and explaining what the evidence actually shows, which he does really well on things like the strength of the German army at this point. But he doesn't do it well in other areas. So that is one gripe I have so far. Overall, though, it's probably the most cogent explanation of this part of the campaign that I've read. It does it nice and neatly, explains who the main players were, why they made the decisions they did, and then how it played out, and does that really, really well, but doesn't take too long to do it so that you lose your idea of where you are. But having read some of the third part, you can tell he's winding up. Looking back on it, you can tell that he's winding up for part 3, which is so far some of the best writing I've seen on the Second World War so far. So that's really all I've got to say for part 2. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you are reading along, definitely continue to part 3. I'm just about to finish part 3. I'm probably going to finish part 3 this evening, and like I said, it is my favorite, or close to my favorite piece of writing about the Second World War that I've ever read. So we're in for a really great video next week. I hope you join us. Let me know what you're thinking of the book so far down below, and also check out David's videos. You'll be able to find them. I'm sure you can all use YouTube, otherwise it's linked down below. Thanks for watching. See you next week. Bye.